Tom Volk, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Pretty good, thank you.
I am super excited to get to talk to you today, and I'm happy we finally could make this happen because I know we've been planning to do this for a while now.
Yeah,
Yeah. So you are a world-renowned mushroom expert. You've contributed greatly to the field of mycology, and as far as I know, you were even the president of the Mycological Society of America at one point, or
I
still
was,
are. Yeah. So
years ago.
it's really a true honor, to have you on the show and to help us, share some of your knowledge and help us become more informed foragers and more just conscious foodies. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
And I think this is probably the perfect timing to have you on too, to have an expert mycologist like yourself on the podcast, because I think most people are getting pretty excited right about now, since the mushroom foraging season is going to kick off here pretty soon. For me, at least, it usually starts with morel mushrooms, and that's one I really want to talk or dive deep into with you today. But before that, I figured we could just start with some more basic concepts that will help us become more informed foragers. Some people might be super familiar or might not be super familiar with the field of mycology, or not even know that there's people like you out there that really spent their whole life trying to understand mushrooms and kind of what role they play in nature, right? So, do you think you can briefly explain what mycology is all about and then maybe share how you became so fascinated with the subject?
So, mycology in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So, mycology is the study of fungi. And so there are, 100,000 known species of fungi, and we think that's probably only 5% of what's out there. So there are a lot of different fungi, and they're everywhere. So one of the remarks I get after students take my mycology classes, they didn't know that fungi were so common. So
Yeah.
then you start to see them everywhere. So I got interested in fungi because I took a class in mycology when I was an undergraduate at Ohio University, and I found out you could get free food. And you could go out in the woods and you could collect food if you knew what you were doing, and that was appealing to a poor college student. So that's kind of what got me started. And a lot of people get started in mycology because of they can eat it or eat the fungi, or their parents or grandparents or uncles or aunts brought them out in the woods to collect. But I started in college. None of my relatives ever took me out.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you came to it as a forager as well. And yeah, it is true. I don't really know anyone who studies mycology who doesn't also eat the mushroom. Definitely know some fishermen that like fish trout and they never eat them, but I
Yeah,
haven't really found the same for
I,
mushrooms
I know a
per
few,
se.
but that they're the exception.
Oh, they're missing out, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, for those of us who might not know some important terms, what are some mycological terms that every mushroom forager should know, in your opinion?
So one of the things to know about fungi is that most of what you see is not the whole fungus. So you see the mushroom above the ground, but then there are miles of what we call mycelium underground that are supporting that fruiting body. And so these mycelium are, they're threads, and they eat their way through the soil by dumping their enzymes to the outside, digesting outside of their bodies, and then absorbing the small molecules that they've made, and then advance into that space that they've made by digesting out the wood or the soil or whatever it is. So they're able to digest things and go inside things that other organisms can't. And so they're, unlike us, we see our food. We go to the fancy restaurant, you order the surf and turf or the tofu surprise or whatever, and you find the food and you ingest it, and the enzymes inside your body break it down, and then you absorb the small molecules. But if we were to go to the fancy restaurant, we would dump our enzymes onto the food and then stick our fingers in it perhaps to absorb the small molecules. and eat our food that way. And so there's a basic difference in the way that fungi eat compared to the way animals eat.
Yeah.
And so most of what we see, is not the whole fungus. Most of it is the supporting material that's underground. So picking a mushroom does not really harm the organism itself.
Yeah, so the mycelium is, I think that's the one of the most important terms everyone should know. And the way I kind of like to think about it is like more comparing it to plants, almost like the root structure. Although I think if you look at like if you think of a tree, the main organism is probably the tree, whereas with the mushroom, the main organism is the mycelium, and then
That's exactly correct. Most of the important part is under. You could argue that with the tree as well, that the roots are more important than the leaves, but the leaves can photosynthesize and do all sorts of other things. The mushroom, when it's sent up, doesn't do anything anymore. It just is making spores. It's not feeding at all anymore.
So it's just basically used for reproduction at that point.
Yes.
And I say mushroom a lot. You say fungi or fungi. Which one do you prefer?
I say fungi, but you can say whatever you want.
Yeah. So, but that would be the correct term from a mycologist perspective. Would be not mushroom, but fungi. And then
fungi is a big term that includes all sorts of things that don't produce mushrooms. So the molds and yeasts and things like that are also fungi, but they don't produce mushrooms. So we use the word mushroom or fruiting body for the structure that's produced, that's macroscopic, that makes spores. It's big.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's just an important kind of distinction to make. And now, I think personally, the more like as foragers, hunter gatherers, whatever you want to call us, the more we learn about like kind of the big picture, the ecology, the better we become and more skills we build, just the more informed we get, and then also the more appreciation we get for nature and the whole, and not just the one species we're looking for. And I don't think a lot of people know, they might know how to find a certain species of fungi, but they don't really know much about the role they really play. So I figure we could maybe go over some of those primary roles that fungi really do play in an ecosystem.
Okay. So some of the fungi we call saprophytes or saprobes, and they are eating the dead materials. So they're digesting the wood, or they're digesting things in the soil, or leaves, or things like that. So things that are already dead. And then there are some fungi that have associations with living organisms, especially plants. And some of those harm the plants, and we call those parasites. So there are many parasites of plants, and there are parasites of humans as well. Yeast infections and cryptococcal meningitis, for example, are a couple examples of human diseases caused by fungi. And then there are many fungi that have a mutualistic association with other organisms, especially plants. And some of those are mycorrhizae. So, for example, almost all trees and plants, other plants, have an association of fungi with their roots. And those are called mycorrhizae. And morels do this sometimes. We can talk about that later. There are also associations in lichens. So fungi are associated with algae, and it's a mutualistic association. Both organisms benefit. And one really common mutualism that we don't really talk about that much are called endophytes. And endophytes are fungi that live in the leaves or the stems or the roots of plants. And they help them out by producing chemicals that deter them from being eaten.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, because that's, one of the listeners, so I actually asked some people on Instagram, I told them that I'm having a mycologist on if they had any questions. And one of them was basically, what role do the fungi play in like for a healthy soil, and what role do they play in nutrient sharing with plants and all that? Can you go a little bit more into that? I mean, you just touched on it a bit, but are they, I mean, it seems like they're super critical for all that to happen.
Right. So the mycorrhizae are probably the most important of those associations. And there's a mutual benefit because the fungi get food from the plant in terms of sugars from photosynthesis, but in return they scavenge in the soil for minerals that are essential to the growth of both the fungus and the plant. They also help to scavenge water because they have a huge surface area, and they can scrounge water and they can scrounge those minerals even in a very dilute solution. And then they gradually pass those to the plant, that then they're used in making all sorts of things in the plant, enzymes and coenzymes and structural materials as well. Contributing to that are the fungi that grow solely in the soil, and they're breaking down the chemicals that are found in the dead plants so that the mycorrhizae can take them up into the live plants. And so the soil organisms are playing a big role as well, even if they're not mycorrhizal with the plant.
Yeah, that's so cool. I've even heard of like certain plants exchanging nutrients between each other together, like through this mycorrhizal network.
Yeah, they call it the wood wide web. These
that.
mycorrhizae are sometimes shared between plants, either the same species or not, and they can trace radioactive materials if you in order to test this between the plants. So there's lots of communication going on underground. There's a lot of stuff going on underground that we don't think about that much.
Yeah, that's why we have people like you studying it. And I mean,
I've been studying what happens underground for 40 years, and I think I understand it now, but I don't understand it well enough to tell anybody.
Ooh, well, maybe have you ever thought about writing a book or anything like that?
I don't think I'm going to write a book, but I think I want to make a 3D model of it.
Ooh, that would be interesting. Yeah, I'd be very excited to see something like that.
So we'll see. It's sort of formed in my head, but I need help.
Yeah, I mean, you do have some awesome graduate students. I'm sure that can help you out. So, you did just mention that like one of the roles is basically, I think you call it a saprobe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what morels are? The morel mushroom?
So morels can act as saprophyte saprobes, um, and they're easily grown easily to grow the mycelium in the lab. But they also can be mycorrhizal. Mm-hmm. So they have an association in the Midwest with elm trees and ash trees and things like that as well. So they kind of straddle that, those two parts in nature.
Yeah. Well, I think we should get into a little bit more into the morel, because it's just such a great mushroom for beginners to go after, and it's really like one of the main mushroom that just a forager of any level really is excited to go after, and it's just a prized gourmet food that we can get from the wild, right?
In some places like Indiana, if you say you're going mushroom hunting, that means you're going morel hunting.
Yeah, it's basically all that people do. It's very true. And as I understand it, there was really a time in your life when you became like absolutely obsessed with the morel mushroom. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you are the first person to ever publish a scientific paper on the life cycle of the morel mushroom. Is that true?
I published a life cycle, but there were other people that proposed stuff before that.
Okay, but you published the life cycle for the first time. Do you think you can tell us the story behind how that all happened? How you got so into the mushroom?
So I was in graduate school and I was working on a project that was not working out. It turns out we didn't have the tools at the time in the lab to be able to study the question that I was trying to ask. And so by chance, I went on a morel hunt with one of my friends, and we found 18 pounds of morels. And
wow,
And so and my professor proposed that I work on that instead. And so I totally switched over after 3 years of working on this other thing, and started to study them in the lab, try to culture and cultivate them, and study the cytology, what was going on inside the cells, looking at the nuclei, and things like that. And so eventually the product of my PhD was my thesis on the life cycle of the morel, and doing some experiments with them to try and show what they were, how they were working, and how they were different from other mushrooms.
Wow. So how long did that whole how long did you really then study just a morel? Was it several
About five
years?
about 5 years.
Oh wow. And then I'm assuming that you got to go on some pretty cool field trips during that time.
I did.
Were there
So mostly
any
in the Midwest, but eventually I hunted morels in other places.
were you ever able to go out of the country to look for them?
The only time I ever did outside of this country was in Israel. We went to the Tel Dan in Israel, which is the source of the Jordan River, and we were there in January, and we found one morel. That was the last, and it was, they usually don't find them in January, but there it was, under Syrian ash trees. And so that was the 12th month that they had found the morels in it. So it's a very unusual morel, different kind of life cycle than what goes on in North America.
Okay, so it kind of changes depending on where the morel really is.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if we go out west, we're mostly looking at fire morels. So
Mm.
post fire morels, ones that come up the year after, a big burn, and we don't really see that in the east so much.
Yeah, that is one question I definitely want to get into a little bit later. What kind of natural disasters, or just what are some of those events that really can spur that growth of the morel mushroom. But first, I think we should maybe get into, maybe we can talk about what kind of species or how many species of morels there really are out there, and then which ones the foragers prefer to go after, and if they're all edible and whatnot.
So when I was in grad school, there were 4 species of morels in the world, but they were pretty variable. There are yellow morels and gray morels and black morels. Well, half-free morels, so they're about 4 species.
And these are the common morels, right? Or true
Yeah.
morels, they're called true morels.
Yes.
Yeah.
False morels are another thing, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's been other kinds of studies now that show that there are, the species, the thing we were calling Morchella esculenta in North America is not found in North America. It's a European name for a European species.
Really?
And so we have for the yellow morels, I don't remember the exact number, but it seems like there's 15 other species of yellow morels, and there's maybe 20 species of black morels. And so in Wisconsin, we find the black morels further north. In other places, they're intermixed. There's mostly black morels after the fires in the west.
And all of the Morchella or Morchella, how did you call it?
I say Morchella, but you can say whatever you want.
The whole Morchella, that's a genus, right?
Yes.
Those are all edible.
Yes.
Okay, that's good to know. So, and then like you said,
There are some that are more delicious than others. Some that are bigger. Some people say there's more flavor in the black morels. I haven't seen that huge difference. It seems to be more dependent on where I've collected them.
Do you think the flavor is impacted by the area that they're
Yes.
collected in? Really?
I think the fire morels are not as tasty as the Midwestern ones.
Okay.
And I think some of the flavor is in the bacteria and the yeast that live inside them.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And the fire morels don't have very many of those bacteria and yeast.
They probably all get killed off from
Right.
the year before. Okay. Interesting. Wow. And then so you said that, there's black morels, there's like the blonde morels, gray morels. Is there like an evolutionary reason for them having all those different colors? I think they are
Things
this.
happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an impact on their survival.
Hmm.
It just happened that way.
Yeah. It's just something I was curious about. And
But the gray morels are the same species as the yellow ones.
oh really? But
There's different times of the year that they come up. It depends on. I have found under the same tree, yellow ones and gray ones, and the let's see, the gray ones were in the shade, and the yellow ones were in the sun.
hmm,
So
fascinating.
they're the same. They're the same thing, and this is shown with DNA studies as well.
That's good to know because I've definitely had a little like not arguments but discussions about that with my friends. I've also found that I think that like the yellow ones are usually the ones that get way larger from
Right,
personal experience. Is
and
that
they usually happen later in the year. So those are what we would call an ecotype, that are formed during a certain period of time, or because in the later in the year we're on north slopes looking for them, and that's just seems to be what has happened on those slopes.
yeah? And then so that's all the Morchella genus of Morchella, and then there's also though the false morels that we might confuse these true morels with, right?
Right,
Can we
and
talk
then
about those a bit?
the false morels are not particularly closely related to the true morels, and anybody who's really seen morels is not going to confuse them, but they're pretty easy to distinguish from one another. The true morels are hollow, and the false morels have kind of stuffed with mycelium. And the points of attachment are different, but that's difficult to just illustrate. But
Yeah, it's almost like
and
the true morel. They're like a balloon, right? They touch right in the stem for most of them at least, and then
right.
they're like hollow like a balloon. That's kind of how I always try to
Mm-hmm.
remember it.
And the false morels are they're attached only at the top, and they're like sort of an umbrella going over the stem. But the false morels can contain a chemical called monomethylhydrazine, which can be cleaved to rocket fuel.
Really?
Chemical that's the same as rocket fuel, and so that affects the central nervous system and affects red blood cells.
Oh Jesus.
So it's really unclear, and I'll get arguments about this, that how much of the toxin is in each of the species. And it's been really difficult to distinguish between the species until relatively recently. And so there needs to be a lot more study on it to determine which species are most toxic.
How
So there,
far?
there, there are
Yeah.
people who have eaten them for years, and they'll start swearing at you when you tell them they shouldn't probably eat those. But I once got an email from a woman in Finland who told me they call it the Finnish fugu. That
Ooh.
that fish that if you cook it wrong, you die.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so you have to have a special license to sell it in Finland. And what you have to do is you boil the mushroom, and throw away the water,
Mm-hmm.
and boil the mushroom again and throw away the water, and then you can prepare it how you want. And it has to be well ventilated because the chemical is volatile. And
Okay,
so
so
people have gotten sick from inhaling the fumes from these preparations. And so, at least some of the species contain monomethylhydrazine, and some of them contain much less of it, and some of them probably don't have it at all.
what are those some of those species by name? There's one I know that starts with G, right?
Morchella gigas I don't know which have the toxin, which don't. Or sorry, Gyromitra gigas. There's Gyromitra brunea, Gyromitra esculenta, which, despite its esculent name, which means edible, is actually the worst one for the toxin as far as we know. So I don't think it's a mushroom for beginners anyway. Even if there's in certain parts of the country or the world, people eat them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like you said, I really think once you kind of, learn to identify a true morel, it's like comparing, elk to white-tailed deer, or like an antelope to a white-tailed deer.
Yeah,
For those hunters out
that's a
there listening.
good analogy.
Yeah. And, you did mention that you can kind of boil them if you were going to try to eat them. That's something I see actually with a lot of, or hear about with a lot of wild plants, even like
Hmm.
milkweed. People do that. Is that just like a kind of a common method to get rid of some toxins?
That seems to be, I've seen it a lot in Eastern Europe and Russia, especially. They boil a lot of things that we don't consider to be edible at all, and
Mm.
then, um, eat them after that.
Have you been out in Russia much for?
I've never been in Russia, no.
Okay, yeah, yeah, but people do the boiling part, which is really interesting to me. So, we did talk about kind of how morels interact maybe with their flora and fauna out there, so they can either be saprobes or also have these mycorrhizal
Mhm.
kind of networks where they're actually aiding and sharing nutrients between plants and whatnot. Is that the extent of it, or does it do? Can they even be more versatile and how they interact with other species
So
out
one
there?
of the things I studied in for my thesis was this formation of what we call sclerotia. And sclerotia are these hard structures, maybe this big, that are storage of nutrients. So that, they're very hard, and they're formed the summer before, while the fungus is growing and there's plenty of food from the tree or from wherever it's getting it. And um, that's then the sclerotium is this overwintering structure. And then in the spring, the sclerotium has all this energy in it that's stored up, and that's what's used to make the fruiting body in the spring, to make the mushroom in the spring. Other mushrooms have a different strategy where they grow during the summer and then produce their mushroom in the fall, and they don't have these sclerotia. So that's the reason we have these morels so early in the spring, is because of the sclerotium that overwinters, and then pops up the mushroom in the spring if the
Uh,
conditions are right.
that's fascinating. So yeah, that's more, that's like a detail of the life cycle, right? That you kind of need, where you kind of need to understand the life cycle to really understand why, for example, morels come up in the spring. Do you think we can go over the life cycle a little bit? I actually have a picture we could share from your
Okay.
blog, which I think would be really fun to look at here. And it is, most people do listen to the podcast, so maybe we can try to explain it as best as possible, but, uh, you know, we'll do our best.
Okay. So if you start with the mushroom that you're familiar with, the fruiting body, they form, if you put the pointer where it says ascus, with ascospores. And those are the structures, the microscopic structures where the spores are produced. And the spores are released. They'll puff out sometimes. It's kind of fun if you blow over them or the wind changes, the spores will puff out. And the spores are released into the air and they germinate. And when they do that, they can form a mycelium. And we call that the primary mycelium because it comes right from the spore. And so if you have two primary mycelia that are compatible with one another, they'll fuse.
Mm.
And we call that plasmogamy. And that forms a secondary mycelium. And the secondary mycelium can grow. And during the summer, they start to form the sclerotia when the conditions start to become harsh toward the fall. And in the spring, they have the option to germinate back into a mycelium. If the conditions are good, why make a fruiting body? Because the fruiting body is going to move it to a new spot because its conditions are getting bad. But if the conditions are just fine, if there's plenty of food, they can go back to forming a mycelium. However, if the conditions are bad, the host tree dies, or there's a fire or some kind of disturbance, those sclerotia grow into the fruiting bodies.
Okay. So it looks like it can turn into the sclerotium even if it's just in its primary mycelia too. It doesn't necessarily need to fuse with another one.
Right. And so that's another way to overwinter. And I've certainly gotten sclerotia to form from primary mycelium. That's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Usually it ends up being because of a bit of starvation, and change of temperature is how it knows that it's starting to be fall.
So what do you starve them? Like, how do you starve them? You just
Just
don't.
don't give it as much food.
What do you usually give them as food?
I grew them mostly on auger, but I also grew them on grains, rye grains.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, no, I think this is like really good to understand. And just, I mean, understanding this now, really just gives me a lot more appreciation for the mushroom itself. And it's kind of cool how it can fuse mycelium. So like maybe necessary, but maybe helpful when they are moving to a new space, new place, that they can like those spores can then form or germinate and then form this primary mycelium and then attach themselves basically to an already existing mycelium. Is that kind of how it works?
Not necessarily. They might fuse with one another, but most likely they're a different. There's some complicated genetics that prevent that from happening. For the most part, they would find the roots of the tree and form an association with that, or just continue to eat whatever food they're eating in the soil.
Okay, got it. Yeah, cool. Do you think there's any other way we foragers can maybe use this life cycle to make maybe more informed decisions besides just understanding that the sclerotium is really the reason why it comes out in the spring?
I think that's the main thing, is to understand that's why it happens. I've dug down to try and find the sclerotia, and they're really hard to find. They're not a really distinctive entity because they grow around all the soil particles that are there, and so they would take some a little bit more energy to and time to recognize them as a real entity. But I have seen them out. I've collected them in the West in fires. You can dig down, and the sclerotia are mostly intact. By the time you know where to look, because the mushroom is formed, the sclerotia has been used up.
Yeah. And then I've also heard though that before they push up a fruiting body, they're inedible. Is that true?
Yeah, I don't think so.
No.
They're
Okay.
just. I've eaten the mycelium itself.
Really?
Yeah, I tried making a. I was going to have if I couldn't get it to fruit, I was going to try and eat the mycelium. And there actually were several patents in the 1950s and 60s about eating the mycelium of the morels. And so I grew some on in a flask, in a floating culture, and they would shake it every once in a while, a little bit, and it would form layers. And so I tried frying that up, and I had visions in my head. I was going to market this, and I had a trade name for it and everything. And then I tasted it, and it tasted like morels, but it also felt like eating hair.
Oh, that's funny.
And so it was not that appealing.
Not too much culinary use for hair, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There
man.
were probably ways to modify it, but that I know a lot more now than I did then. But
Yeah. That's awesome though. I mean, identifying mycelium, I think, probably takes IDing mushrooms to a whole nother level.
yeah,
Like, you got to be a real expert for those. So, yeah, thanks for sharing this life cycle with us. That's really, really fascinating. Um, you were just talking about that you were growing the mycelium in the flask, but one of the reasons that morels are so highly prized, highly sought after, is because of their inability to really be farmed like other mushrooms, right? Like maybe an oyster
right.
or like the shiitake. So many people have tried, as far as I understand it, but not really succeeded in really bringing like a farmed morel to the market. Um,
There have been several attempts to do it. There are actually a couple patents on morel cultivation from the 1980s, and they were able to grow morels in production, but it was not particularly reliable. So if you're going to grow something commercially, you have to be able to provide a certain number of pounds or kilograms of each of the, to a restaurant or a store or something. And if you can't do it reliably, then you can't really make a market for that.
Yeah. I mean, how much do morels really sell for? It's like 20, $30 a pound, right?
Yeah, during the season, they're probably around 10 when they're really abundant. But the idea is if you could grow morels in the fall, there would be no competition from people collecting them from the wild.
True. Yeah.
So it's the same thing, with farm raising trout or something like that. You could, there's a particular season where you can catch them, but if you can provide them year round by having them in your pond or whatever your facility is, you can, make more money doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then I was also told to ask you about this story of a guy from Michigan who had a patent on the morel cultivation, but then like suddenly died. Do you think you can share
Yeah,
that
that
with
was
us?
that was Ron Ower was a graduate student at San Francisco State University, and he was able to cultivate morels in his kitchen. And so he tried to get mainstream mushroom companies to become interested in the process, and he couldn't. And so there was a startup at Michigan State that became interested in it, and they eventually published a patent, 4,950. I don't remember the number anymore. 4,594,840 or something like that. And before the patent came out, Ron Ower was murdered in a park in San Francisco. So it probably
Jesus.
had nothing to do with the patent, but
But
I received an email from his sister after I published some of the stuff that I did, and they had never solved what happened to him.
was he? But there was also like a contract he had with Domino's Pizzas or something like that, right?
So eventually, they sold the patent rights to Domino's Pizza, and there was no intention of ever putting them on pizzas, but there was just another company, and they tried to repeat all of his experiments, and they were able to do it, but not, as I said, not very reliably. And eventually, the patent was sold to another company. I want to say Moonlight Mushrooms, but I'm not sure of that now. And they built a very large plant in Auburn, Alabama, and tried to automate everything, and it didn't work.
Hmm. So you think he
Um,
maybe left some parts out of his patent?
I think that, well, the patents are written so vaguely that you can't really tell what they did. The temperature was between 10 and 100 degrees C, and the
No.
relative humidity was between 50 and 100%. And, the things like that, they were so vague, you couldn't really tell what they did. Um, and so, this company in Auburn failed. There are some other companies. I have a former colleague who works for a mushroom company in Pennsylvania, and he was involved in testing somebody else's growth of their morels. And it seems to work, but not really reliably. And then there are several Chinese companies that show you pictures of their morels growing. They're mostly outside. So, there are some successes happening, but they're obviously, you're not going to the store and buying morels.
How,
So it's not really successful.
how likely are you think those pictures from China are those all real?
Sure, why not? Actually, my one of my former students has visited that and said they were in the soil.
Okay. So what I'm kind of hearing you say is like we're definitely making some progress there, even though
Yeah,
we
and
have.
it's only there are some species that are not as dependent on the trees, and those are the species that they're growing. And it turns out, we were calling it the same thing as all the other ones, but with molecular techniques and other techniques, we've been able to find out that really it's a totally different species.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. How much like do you really think we know about fungi? Like how has mycology been a field for a long time?
So mycology is relatively young compared to like the study of plants, for example. And there have been many fewer people studying mycology over the centuries. And so we're a bit behind. There's still a lot of, and that's partially due to the cryptic nature of fungi. If you're going to study a plant, for example, it's always there, and you might not fruit all the time, but you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the mushrooms are there indicating where the mycelium is for just a very short period of time. And then not necessarily every year, it can be 20 years between fruiting sometimes.
Yeah. So it's would you say it's almost like the ocean where we say we have only discovered a very small amount of it and there's still a lot more to figure out?
That sounds like a good analogy.
Okay. Hey, so anyone interested in mycology, there's still lots to discover. It's a good field to get into.
There is a lot to discover.
Yeah. And yeah, so this guy from the guy who worked with the startup in Michigan, he just all of a sudden he just died.
Yeah, he was murdered. He was murdered in a
Oh,
park in San
really? He was
Francisco.
murdered. And they think it's just a random murder.
That seems to be the case. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sounds like there might be some conflict of interest there, but who knows? It's just
Yeah. I don't. Nobody really thinks that.
yeah, okay. Okay. So yeah, morels, we talked about, what they are, what kind of species there are, if they're edible or whatnot. But where do they really grow? Like if I were to go out as a forager and try to look for them, obviously it depends on, like you were saying, under region a lot. But are there some things we know?
It really depends on what part of the country you're in, or what part of the world. Here in Wisconsin, we look generally under dead elm trees, trees that have died within the last year or two, especially within the last year. But further north in Wisconsin, we look under conifers.
Mm-hmm.
So and then you go further south and you're looking under ash trees or tulip poplars. For the most part, go to the west, you're under conifers, but after a fire or
Okay.
after some kind of disturbance, such as logging. And so, it really depends exactly where you are, where you look.
Do we know why in the Midwest it's the elm tree? Like, is there a certain reason
There,
for it
so
being that tree?
my first grad student, Marcia Harbin, worked on synthesizing Morel mycorrhizae in the lab. So we were able to synthesize them with elm trees and prove that they were mycorrhizal. And so our hypothesis is that the mycelium is growing in association with the elm trees, and as long as the elm is healthy, it's getting plenty of sugar to the fungus. It doesn't bother to reproduce. But the elm tree, if the elm tree dies from Dutch elm disease, for example, another fungus, or some other way, the food supply is cut off and the mushrooms form instead because the fungus knows that it has to find a new host. It's not getting the sugar that it needs. And so it's really expensive to form a fruiting body. If you don't have to, don't. So that's what's evolved over the years.
Fascinating.
And so that's why we have this association with the elm trees. But with other ones in the Midwest, we also have association with apple trees, but it's living apple trees. We don't have the apple tree doesn't have to die.
Yeah, because I have found morels. I think I've even seen them under oaks. So it's not just the elm. There's other
They're pretty
trees.
promiscuous sometimes.
Okay. And from what I hear, they're also like pretty adaptable, right? The morel
Right.
itself.
Since they can, I grew them on lots of different kinds of media when I was doing my experiments, and they grew on just about anything I fed them.
And so you said the stage of tree decomposition, so the how dead the elm tree is does matter.
So usually the best fruiting under an elm tree is the year after the tree dies. And so that's usually the most productive. And then gradually that decreases over the years. So like the first year, if you got 100, the next year you might get 20, and the next year you might get 5, or some number like that.
And is the like what does a tree like that look like? It's probably still has bark on it, right?
Right. The trees gradually lose their bark. Uh, there are some that still have the bark intact, which indicates they probably died last year. And then you get some we call sliders, where the bark is just kind of sliding off, and that died probably before that. And then there are smoothies where all of the bark is gone. And only rarely do I find some under the smoothies.
So you want to get them while their sliders are before, ideally.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, because I had someone ask me that question. My answer was kind of, yeah. I mean, that I personally I haven't just been looking for the perfect elm tree. I just kind of been looking under all, and also since I have found them on like by oaks and whatnot, even look under other trees. So I don't know
If it's a really good year for morels, they're more widespread than just the elms.
and is that why is that just because the conditions are good or
Sometimes the conditions are really good. There's plenty of water, and the temperatures hit just at the right time.
what is like the ideal or what are some signs that we can look for to kind of inform if it's going to be a good morel year?
There's got to be plenty of rain the year before, like in fall the year before. And the growth conditions have to be good for the sclerotia. If you have snow, that helps in the winter. And if the snow melts more slowly, that puts the moisture into the ground more slowly instead of running off. And then it has to rain at the right time when the temperature is right.
What is the
So
right
that
temperature?
Well, that I don't know exactly, but usually it's after in Midwest here. It's usually after the night temperatures are in the 50s for several days in a row, and then you get the rains coming in during that same time. Soil temperature is probably important. Soil temperature above 50 Fahrenheit is what we're talking about. So that seems to be the good indicators.
Yeah, that's what you hear mostly is like look for soil temp between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's usually the start of the morel season in a given area. I last year in La Crosse here where we are at least it was pretty bad. From I didn't find many. I think it was mostly because it was such a
Right.
dry time. There was not really much rain at all. And it's
And
interesting.
we're looking at that again right now. I mean, there's no rain projected here for 10 days.
Really. So right now it's April 3rd. Right now we kind of want to be having those rains.
Yeah. Usually around April 25th is when we get the most, that they start here in La Crosse, and then into May and sometimes into June,
If you're
depending on how warm it gets.
yeah, if you're looking at like more hilly terrain, where are you trying to go to find the morels?
Okay. So first you want to look under on in the south slopes, right? Because that gets the sun earlier in the year than the other slopes. And then they usually move to the west slope, then the east slope, then the north slope, and the ridge tops are somewhere mixed in between.
And that's just mostly temperature and how like gradually probably the soil temp rises throughout
Right.
those spots.
It seems to be totally based on temperature, and you see
Fascinating.
that same kind of phenology with the plants that are growing in those areas too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I've kind of noticed that foraging for sure. Ramps, for example, that's definitely the case as well from what I've kind of experienced.
Yeah.
So yeah, as foragers, really paying attention to the weather and kind of, I think that's maybe one of the better ways to build the foraging skills is to really just not pay attention to the single species, but what's going on around it and all
Yeah.
that, because that just informs it so much better. Are there any like myths or folklores that people tell each other about, when the morel starts popping up and whatnot that you've heard of?
They say to look for morels when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear.
Okay.
So I don't
So,
know what that means. What kind of squirrel, what kind of oak, and I
but
don't
it's one
know.
one of those
Often when
stories.
the lilacs are in bloom is so what some people use as indicators, but that seems to be a little bit late. Um, and they look for the wild plums blooming. There's actually a lot of wild plums around here.
Yeah.
So that's another indicator.
You know a lot of good wild plum spots?
I've never collected any really. There's some actually in my neighborhood.
Really? Yeah, me and my friend, we found some in the Cooley experimental forest, like really deep in there, like 40-minute walk in, and that was really exciting. So, but yeah, that's not what we're talking about now. But you know, how does that kind of? So you said the season. How long does it usually last? Would you say like three
Usually about
weeks?
3 weeks. Looking at all the different slopes.
Yeah. So that's so. Look for that 50, 60-degree salt temp, then maybe go or be expect to go out over the next 3 weeks. And ideally, what I like to do is already have maybe go scouting for some dead elm trees
Mm.
beforehand, so you don't have to waste the time scouting, and you can actually just go to your morel spot. And then, like you said, if you had a morel spot from the year before,
Right,
definitely
keep
check that
going.
one. Check that one out too, right? Because they might still be coming up.
Right. And in that area, there's usually other elm trees, that are in other various stages of having died or in stages of dying.
Yeah,
So
it's a
the Dutch elm disease is going to, go from tree to tree. And, over the years, you get more morels under those trees.
Is that a real threat to the morels too? The Dutch elm disease? Like, are people worried not just about the elm but also about the morels?
There's some concern. It's hard to know what, where else the morels are growing. So, you know, for them, it doesn't really matter how much they fruit. It's where they actually can grow. And we don't really know that.
Yeah, that's still to be determined. What about if I'm picking a morel during the season in a spot? Can there be secondary growth, like a second flush that comes up in that
I
single
have
spot?
only very rarely seen a second flush under the same tree in the same year. They seem to be all coordinated, whether it's because of what they're getting from the tree or the aspect, the slope that they're on. I I wouldn't say that I've ever seen a second flush. Sometimes I go back and I find some more, but they were probably ones that were this big and I just missed them the first time.
Hmm. And then once the morel, like let's say here in the Midwest in Wisconsin, once morels kind of start going, I think you can kind of expect them to all start coming out over those next 3 weeks. But I've heard that like out west, there can be a pretty distinct different for like morel seasons because of elevation and all that. Is that something
Right.
you've
Yeah, we don't
experienced?
think so much about elevation here in the Midwest, but that's a big deal in the West. I found morels in August in Colorado at
N-
10,000 feet, and for
no
those
way.
10 minutes, it was spring.
That's incredible. Oh, wow. In August. Wow. So that's really just because it probably doesn't heat up there until then.
Right.
They really need
Yeah, it's
that.
dependent on temperature, and whatever's growing there is adapted to its environment, or it
Yeah.
wouldn't be there.
Yeah. And then, of course, like we said, the morel itself seems to be really adaptable uh, as well. So definitely there is it. So if you're living out there looking for morels, would you focus mostly on maybe you were mentioning earlier, like the burns and the logging events and flooding, or even I know I've heard that big windstorms can really kill a lot of trees and shock the morels. Is that something out west you would so look for more so than just trying to figure out what the temperature is going to be like?
Right. Anything that cuts the connection of between the mycelium and the tree is going to, is a potential trigger that it's time to produce a mushroom. So logging trails, skid trails from dragging the trees down the hills is a good spot to find them. And as we said, after fires. So, and then after storms and disturbances, anything that's going to really disturb the ecosystem, even if it's just the local ecosystem.
Yeah, just like in a small scale. There was one down here in the Driftless. There was around a trout stream 2 years ago where there was like a big field that had gotten burned the year before, and I found morels. They were coming out almost in the field, not necessarily
Mm.
really close to a tree. Is that probably just because the mycelium reaches that far? It's probably,
Sounds like it.
yeah,
I mean, I think there's a lot of niches for the mycelium that we don't really know about. There's actually even been proven that morels can be an endophyte in grasses,
really.
so
So,
they can actually grow inside the stems and leaves of grasses.
yeah, fungi are weird.
Yeah,
That's what's
weird.
cool about them, though. They can take many forms and shapes. What about, I mean, the biggest mycelium from what I've heard, not necessarily morels, but just in general, isn't it like several football fields large? And it's like
Right.
several million or billion years old or something like that?
Um, it's the largest ones that are known are around 2,500 acres,
Wow.
and so they're big. That's a honey mushroom Armillaria. But the morel mycelium seems to be way smaller than that. Most mycelia are way smaller than that.
So, how far from a tree do you usually look when you're
It depends on the
looking?
size of the tree, actually.
Really?
So if it's a bigger tree, it's going to spread its roots further.
Mm-hmm.
So that 18-pound haul I've talked about at the beginning was actually mostly under one tree, and it was a really big elm tree, and it had died the year before. And I could trace out the roots from the trunk and just follow the root system and find morels, and they were big morels.
That's 18 pounds. That's a lot from one tree.
Yeah.
I've never found that many. That's awesome. And I've also, I think it was on your blog where I read that you, some of these burn fields you've been to, you just found just hundreds of morels. Just
Yeah. So after a burn, I've been to the several burns in Oregon and California, and they can be pretty abundant in those areas. But it's the worst collecting I've ever had. You're walking through 6 or 8 inches of ash,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's just really messy.
I guess I didn't think about that. And that's also why the morels are probably a lot more dirtier than when you get them. Well, you did say that they taste better out over here than compared to when you get them from the burn fields. So maybe the ash also plays some role there. Do you think the ash is mostly just keeping? I think you said it was the yeast and microbes, right? That you think add the flavor. You think the
Right.
ash is what's maybe
And the ash is
sanitizing it?
changing. The ash is changing the pH. It's more basic, right?
Oh yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, so fascinating. And then I think you also said that some of these morels can stay under like in underground before fruiting for like 80 to 100 years. Is that true?
That's the normal fire cycle in the West, is
Really?
between 80
So
and 100 years. So they seem to be adapted to that fire cycle. They don't need to produce their fruiting bodies, and they might, every 100 years they might, or longer.
that's so cool. What about out here in the Midwest? Do we know how old some of the
And I don't think
mushroom
anybody,
species are? No.
I don't think we have any idea.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really awesome though to just I don't know, it's just for me personally, the more I know about it, and knowing that these mushrooms or fungi can literally be in the like underground there for 100 years or so before even fruiting, it just makes them that more special to me personally. Um, but yeah, there's just there's a lot to learn about them that I think goes beyond what most foraging books talk about, and that's why I'm happy you're here today, so we can get definitely get a little nerdy about it all. Um, What can we do really to, as a forager, I'm also thinking about sustainability a bit. Maybe making sure that future foragers can go collect the morel for generations to come. What are some of the things we can do to help conserve them, I guess,
So
is if anything?
picking the mushrooms probably doesn't have any effect on the mycelium. Um, there aren't any particular studies that show that, but so we only have indications from other species. But you're not really harming the mycelium if you pick the apple off the tree, as it were. If you use that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like the mesh bag thing that they carry around and spread. They're supposed to spread the spores, and I have not seen evidence that that's true. And there are people who are very passionate about it, so I don't really want to argue about that. But and there are people that say they can be overpicked in an area. I have been through areas where commercial hunters have been, and there's still morels there. They don't get them all. And so it's possible it's cutting back on the number of spores that are being released into the environment for future generations, but we don't really have enough data to say that. It's hard to say. Usually by the time the mushroom's out, it's producing spores. And so, or it's so rotten when you find it, it's already produced its spores. So it's hard to say, what's really going on and how that's happening.
Is there a preferred way of picking it? I mean, some people like to cut them at the base. Some people like to take the whole, take it out with some dirt.
So if you're going to eat them, you're better off just cutting them or pulling them and taking the base off so that you're not you don't get dirt. If you get dirt in your bags of morels, they're near impossible to clean out of the pits in the morels. So you want to pick them clean. There's no evidence that to say whether plucking them or cutting them is better.
Mm-hmm.
With the only evidence we really have is this 30-year study in Oregon looking at chanterelles, another delicious mushroom, where they picked, where they cut or they plucked or they left them alone, and there was basically no statistical effect on the number of chanterelles that came up the next year, or any other year after that.
And they did it for 30 years.
30 years, yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm sure.
So we don't really know. We don't have enough data.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's probably so much out there. There might be so many morel or so much mycelium of morel out there that we just have no idea about, right? Is there like a guesstimate at all?
I've never seen a number.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how would you even do that, right? That'd be incredibly hard. So what is your preferred method of cleaning and storing morels after you forage them? You just mentioned, they do have kind of we talked about how they kind of look like the stem with a little balloon on top, and the balloon part looks almost like a honeycomb, I would say. So yeah, there can be a lot of dirt that gets in there. There can be insects living in there. Also, when you're it's one thing people I think have never picked morels should watch out for is if you're getting them in more sandy soil, there could be some sand grains that actually grow inside the fruiting body. But how do you usually deal with the cleaning?
If you pick them clean, there's minimal cleaning you have to do when you get home. So, the idea is to not have them dirty when you pick them. Mm-hmm. So never put the bases in with your collections. Want to make sure that that it's clean. And then when I get them home, I either wash them or don't, depending on how clean they are. If I wash them, I throw the wash water out in the yard in the hopes that something's going to come up someday.
Yeah, that's another thing. So you said one way to move those spores around would be to just have a mesh bag, right? And another way would be to almost make this morel water to spread around in the yard or woods or whatnot.
Right. And I had that work once in my yard when I lived in Madison, and I threw the wash water out, every year. And eventually there were morels. So, and they were in a place where there were little elm seedlings that grew up against the house that I had cut down, and that's where they came up.
Okay, that's good to know. But yeah, I interrupted you with the cleaning aspect of it.
And so, either wash or don't, but, some people say it's a, sin to wash mushrooms, but it's fine. If you need to, you need to. And then if I'm going to dry them, I never wash them beforehand because that just ruins it.
Hmm.
I cut them in half. If I'm going to dry them, I cut them in half when I get them home.
Do you like it vertically?
Um,
Cut them vertically in
yeah,
half?
vertically, yeah.
Yeah.
And then put them. I have a dryer that I use that I sit on pretty low temperature, and then just dry those, and then I keep them in jars that are sealed. And I think the flavor is actually better after a couple years. I think the flavor develops after a couple years after drying.
Interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I think
So
that
you
happens
really,
with a lot of mushrooms.
so then you just rehydrate them by putting them back into water
Right.
before you cook with them. Wow, that sounds really good. Yeah, I've never done the dehydrating part. This year, I would really like to. I don't know if maybe you've done this, but pickle them in oil, like olive oil, because my grandma is from Italy, and she was telling me how they used to pick all these mushrooms, and like that's how they would mainly preserve them was in olive oil. So I told her I'm
Mhm.
gonna try it with morels this year, see what happens.
That's how my the Italian side of my family made the morels or oyster mushrooms. They would put in oil, and hen of the woods they'd put in oil.
Okay, yeah, it's I've never
But I
tried
haven't.
it that way.
They never collected morels. I don't think. I never heard about that.
Yeah, maybe they don't. I'd have to ask my grandma about that, but it was mostly I think like chanterelles that she would get, and ah, there's another
So
one, the boletes, I think it's called in English.
no Steinpilz.
Steinpitz in German, yes, exactly. I almost didn't know the American name, their English name. I forget that you speak a decent amount of German. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. um, yeah, but that's one good way to use them in the kitchen. I think personally, I'm
But
pretty. Yeah.
some mushrooms don't take well to drying, like chanterelles and like the chicken of the woods. And so what I do with them is I kind of parboil them in water and some olive oil and butter. And then I freeze them in Ziploc bags underwater.
Hmm. Like,
And
and you actually add water into the Ziploc bag?
yes,
Ah.
the water that I cook it with.
Yeah, yeah.
So I cook it, part way, just to kill everything. And then put that into the Ziploc bag and then I store it flat.
Yeah, I've never done it
So
with
that
the.
keeps the flavor much better.
I tried just freezing chicken of the woods, but I ate them pretty fast, within like a month or two.
Yeah.
And I did cook them before, but I never did it with the water together. And morels, I really haven't stored long term at all. It's just been such a treat to eat them right away. And I think they are, personally, from my experience, I think there's a difference if you like eat them within like 24 hours or wait a week, you know. But then again, how you were just saying that maybe dehydrating them can really maybe like strengthen the flavor after a while. I'm not sure what would be going on there scientifically that would happen, but definitely something to try out, and I'm going to try now. Yeah, I personally I think what like to do is I always do like a little salt bath for my morels, but maybe I don't even have to do that. That's just kind of been nice to get some of the insects out and whatnot. It seems like as soon as you put them in a little bit of salt water, those insects just disperse and really get the heck out of there.
Yeah. I don't really care about the insects.
Protein, huh?
So it's just extra protein. It's just the maggots are just like moving rice.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at them. I think in the future here we're gonna have to be eating a lot more bugs anyway to meet everyone's
Yeah,
protein requirements. So
I'm
might
not
as well
opposed to
start
that.
this way.
There's going to be a big cicada feast in the East Coast now this year.
Yeah, I heard about that. There's like a huge invasion of cicadas coming in, and now there's all these like some of the food blogs and whatnot and cooking shows. They're like publishing recipes, cicada
Mhm.
recipes. I
It's
guess
just
I'd try some.
it's like a land lobster, right?
Yeah, I mean I've never tried it, but if that's the case, then I'd be down to catch some. That's for sure. Man, well, we dove really deep into morels. I guess we could talk a little bit more about how to cook him. I personally am pretty simple. I just cook him in with butter and salt, and I think a lot of people like to just enjoy him that way
Yeah.
for their flavor. But people love putting them in pasta if they get enough, or like on top of pizzas. Are there any other fun, creative ways that you've used them?
The most decadent way I ever made morels was I had a visitor from New Orleans, and when she came, she brought me some crawfish tails.
Mm.
And so I made a stuffing, and these are big morels, and I stuffed them with crawfish tails. And then I slathered them in butter and put them on the grill whole. And then cooked them that way. And then I took them and I sliced them, what would be horizontally on the mushroom, and had like the calamari rings of stuffed, morels
Wow,
stuffed with the crawfish tails.
that sounds
That was that was
delicious.
that was pretty good.
Yeah, that sounds gourmet. It's not something you'd get at a real high end restaurant.
Oh yeah, that was a $50 meal.
Yeah. Well, that's the nice part about foraging, you're like, I mean, you are putting into work, right? Going out there and you're learning about how to do it first, and you got to go put some miles on sometimes to find some good trees. But the reward is usually something that a lot of people don't just have access to, and it is really high end in
Yeah.
restaurants. People pay a lot of money for some of these food ingredients that you get from the wild.
And I think that's one of the reasons that the foraging has really increased in popularity in the last several years. Besides the eating local, you have the satisfaction of collecting your own food, and you're more connected to your where the food comes from, which we tend to be this disconnect of in the supermarket and us. So I think that's why this foraging has really taken off.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the main reasons I started a podcast. It's just because I was getting into all of this, and the more skills I was building, the more I was out in nature, just the more right it felt, honestly. And people were interested in what I was doing, and I figured start the podcast and then get experts like yourself to share their knowledge, and then everybody can learn from it. So
Mhm.
it's awesome that it is becoming such a thing now. I definitely think there's enough mushrooms for a lot more people out there to go foraging. Um, Mushroom foragers we are, definitely a little protective about our spots, but I think that that's just fair because you are putting in all that work to find them in the first place. And then, if
There,
you,
there are there are a lot of people who are beginners, and they just need some training in how to do this more sustainably, and to not disturb the land around where they're collecting the mushrooms and things like that. There's some education that's needed for this to become more widespread. As it's becoming more widespread, people need to
yeah,
learn.
and that's one of the main reasons I wanted you to talk a little bit about, the role of the morel in the greater ecosystem. And
Mhm.
I don't know, it's just that is just crucial, I think, if we want to make it a sustainable thing for the future as well. Um, but yeah, we talked about a lot about the morel. I think we got nerdy enough. Is there anything else anything fascinating that's or is it something that's been fascinating you over the years about the morel that we didn't talk about that you would like to share?
That's most of it. They're fun to hunt, and even if you don't find any, you get to go out in the woods in the spring after being cooped up for a while. So it's fun even if you don't find anything.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's healthy for you. You're
Mhm.
walking outside, especially around here, you're walking all these bluffs usually. Then you might be finding deer sheds if you're deer hunting. If you forage other plants, you might still find like fiddleheads or maybe some ramps
Mhm.
and whatnot. So that's why it's just fun to get into all of this at once, because then you can combine things. And honestly, last year when I was deer scouting for deer in the fall, I mean, I came back with oysters or chicken of the woods and other mushrooms every time, basically. So every like scouting trip was also a mushroom hunting trip, which is really
Yeah,
awesome.
lots of fisher people and hunters find morels and such when they're not finding their fish or their squirrels or whoever.
Yeah.
So those things go together pretty well. One of the best meals I ever had was a trout stuffed with chanterelles
Ooh,
on the grill. So that was really good.
you're giving me all sorts of ideas today. I love it. I gotta try some of these things out. Cool. Well, I'd like to slide away maybe from this topic of wild mushrooms and go a little
Yeah.
more into how the fungi really, or how they affect our food production system, because that's a real thing that I just recently heard you talk about a little bit that I think people need to hear about. So you're also involved in like studying food safety from a mycologist perspective,
Right.
right? And so, what can you tell us about specifically what I've heard you talk about is mycotoxins and their presence in our food supply?
Yeah. So mycotoxins are um, chemicals that are produced by fungi, usually to deter competitors, like other fungi or bacteria. So penicillin, for example, is a mycotoxin from the perspective of bacteria. This is what we call a secondary metabolite that is being produced that kills off the competition. And so some of these are produced that are harmful to us. Probably the most well-known one is called aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is commonly found in peanuts because peanuts grow underground and this is a soil organism. And so aflatoxin is a known carcinogen, and it's carcinogenic at 1 part per billion. So that's micrograms per kilogram.
So
So it's
very small.
one of the most toxic things we know of.
Really,
The only chemical I know of that's more toxic is the botulism toxin.
really.
And so it causes liver cancer, causes death, causes liver necrosis. And so it's a problem.
It sounds
And
like it.
so,
Yeah.
so there is a limit. The USDA limits the amount of aflatoxin that you're allowed to have in peanut butter. And that number is 20 parts per billion.
Wow. So way higher than what the carcinogenic load would be.
Right. It
What did
was
you
the
say?
it was the smallest amount that could be measured with the technology at the time the regulations were made.
Okay. So basically, the concern are these mycotoxins. They're these byproducts from the molds mostly.
Right. These are the mycotoxin. I should have clarified they were from molds that were growing on the grains or the peanuts.
Okay. And you mentioned one aflatoxin. That's the really that we know that one is really bad for humans.
Right.
Now, are other mycotoxins, other of these secondary metabolites that we should be worrying about?
So there are about 500 known mycotoxins. A lot of them are produced by fungi in the genus Fusarium. And some of these are pretty toxic. There's one that can cause, that grows on barley that can cause bubbles, excessive bubbles um, in the beer that's produced from the barley. It's called vomitoxin. So
Does
you
not
can
sound
guess what the
good.
symptoms are.
Yeah.
There's another one called fumonisin that may actually be responsible for Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS.
Really?
And there are a bunch of other ones as well that are known to affect livestock. They would be eating moldy grains or things like that, or moldy hay or whatever they're eating.
So these are a real concern in our food supply, mostly because the FDA only checks for some, and then what they check for, they allow for way more to get through than what we
Right.
scientifically know
And
is bad
nobody's
for us.
checking for what the animals are eating. You feed them what they have, and these can grow, particularly in silos and other ways to store grains and hay and such. Those fungi can grow in there really easily. They just need moisture and they have the food.
Okay, and is it more because I think from what I was hearing you say, I think it was another podcast that it's mostly like organic foods that are a concern. Is that true?
Right. So one concern about organic food is they don't have any fungicide sprayed on them,
Yeah.
which means they're much more likely to have the fungus growing on them. And if we look at the case of, there are some fusarium toxins that grow in corn, they're much more likely to have invasion by the insects that bring in the fungus if they're grown organically. So no fungicide, no insecticide. They can get more contaminated more easily. And so same thing for organic peanut butter. There have been cases where there are 60,000 parts per million of aflatoxin in organic peanut butter.
Jesus, you're scaring me here.
That's the point. So, most of the name brand, of the name brand peanut butter companies are very little aflatoxin. They're way below the standards. There are methods to get rid of that. Look into individual peanuts, basically, is what you have to do. And there are ways of doing that in the industry. They send the peanuts down a conveyor belt and one by one. And if they shine a UV light at it, ultraviolet light, and aflatoxin glows back, blue or green, and all those peanuts are kicked out of the line and probably sold to somebody else.
So probably for that peanut oil, that super refined like peanut oil that so many restaurants like to use. But yeah, man, wow. So basically, what would a peanut look like when we were opening it? Can we tell just by
You can
looking
tell
at
if it's
it?
moldy. You might have been in a bar or restaurant or somewhere where you're eating peanuts and you throw the shells on the floor and all that, and you get one that's really bitter and you spit it
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
That's aflatoxin.
Okay, that's not good. And you're saying like this tiny amount can be super, super carcinogenic.
Right.
Wow. And the FDA, like, what do you say, 20 parts per billion is what they allow? And that's like 20 times as much as what's carcinogenic. How is that not like more talked about? I feel like this is like some,
I have never heard the people pushing organic foods talking about mycotoxins.
and I'm a big proponent of organic foods and whatnot. But how, I'm trying to wrap my head around this because how did ancient cultures deal with something like that?
Died.
Do you think this was a concern back
Mhm.
then as well, or is it maybe just the
It
way we?
still is. And one of my former students works for the CDC, Center for Disease Control, looking at exposure of people from Kenya to aflatoxins, and it's in their bloodstream. So he does
Whoa,
HPLC on the blood of people they've collected from there.
whoa,
And so, in some cultures, this is, in places where maybe the economy isn't so good, people are eating moldy foods.
yeah. So you don't think it's more like the way we're producing these foods today? Because even some organic, big organic farms are doing questionable, growing their foods questionably.
Right.
If I'm having a garden at home, is this something I need to be worried about necessarily?
Probably not. Because in a garden situation, you're really picking out your individual foods, and you're not eating the moldy stuff for the most part. So I think that's, usually pretty safe. We have to have some tolerance for food that might be superficially infected, that are ugly.
Hmm.
I don't think fruit doesn't have to look beautiful.
True. Yeah. It's kind of crazy how the stores these days, at least I know this is how it's in Europe, they have like a standard for the size of the cucumber, and it needs to, like, the banana needs to look exactly
Yeah,
like this certain way, the perfect
yeah. There's
banana. And
there's
then
well, bananas are going to go extinct in the next 5 years. So expect another kind of banana
yeah,
because of a fungus.
I did do a project a while back in that in school. That is a whole nother topic of itself.
Yes,
That
it
is
is.
kind of crazy because they're all clones of each other, basically.
Right.
The bananas. Wow. So, yeah, but this is just really interesting. I think something that more people should be talking about because it could be a giant public health issue. Like, who knows how many foods out there are, you know, have these uh, mycotoxins in them, these secondary metabolites, and could be, um, you know, influencing all these chronic diseases that we're having today. Could be something that's happening.
Most of them are probably at a really low concentration. And like always, the poison is in the dose.
Yeah,
The
but if you're
same thing.
saying like a tiny peanut could potentially,
So, I mean, you should probably be a little bit less worried about fungicides, that are commercially produced. People like to pick on glyphosate, Roundup. Copper sulfate that's used in organic farming is way more toxic than glyphosate.
really. What
Like
is that called?
copper sulfate.
Copper sulfate. I'll have to look into that. Yeah, because that's what I mean. There's definitely organic farms that, they might have the organic seal, but they're still doing really using questionable practices like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's something to definitely think about. I don't know if, like, is if I'm producing, or let's say I'm using fungicides, right? Uh, and the mold's already there. Do those secondary metabolites get destroyed, or could those
No,
foods
once
still?
they're produced, the aflatoxin, for example, is really stable.
Okay.
I mean, you can even autoclave it for days and nothing happens to it.
What's autoclave?
Oh, pressure cooker.
Pressure cook it. Okay.
So you could put it at very high temperature and high pressure, and it's still, um, it doesn't go away.
Oh, that's not good at all, man. So, but that means it could even be non-organic, like foods that weren't grown organically, that could still have this on them
Sure.
potentially. Okay. Wow,
So
that's some serious
some of it
stuff.
is the timing of when you put the fungicide on, and there are forecasting models to be able to do that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the fungicides. How persistent are they? Because I'm sure you know more than the average person about them, but how persistent are fungicides in our environment, and do we know kind of what effect they have on humans? Because I've heard that, like, humans and fungi are, our DNA is pretty similar, right? Or the way
Right.
it
We have
affects
our
us.
physiology is similar, and so that's what we're concerned about. I'm not saying you should put fungicide on everything.
Yeah.
That's not the point of what I'm talking about with mycotoxins. But something like Roundup, gets all the press. It has a relatively short half life. It degrades in the soil pretty fast, and there are some uses of it that are probably not particularly ethical, but there are some uses where it's way safer than worrying about the particular mycotoxins that might be there,
Yeah, that's a really, really good point that I
or
just never thought about.
or whatever's going to happen to that.
And
So there, it really depends on. I don't think you can lump all of the fungicides or pesticides together. It depends on the chemistry of them. I'm not saying you should use Roundup either. So don't send me hate mail. Um, but there are choices to be made. And we're talking about genetically modified foods. The corn that they've modified with the Bt toxin, that is, keeps the insects away, keeps the fungus away because the insects don't get in there.
so the
And
insects are the
so,
main carrier of the fungus.
right, into the ears of the corn. So if you can prevent the insect invasion, you can prevent the mycotoxins. And
And
so, it's a
that's something we
trade-off.
can say pretty like safely? It's
Yeah.
mostly the insects. Okay.
So which one are you going to worry about more? The mycotoxins or some idea that GMO is bad? And so I don't think you can put all the GMOs in one category either. There are some that seem to be really good and really well thought out, and there are some that maybe aren't.
Yeah.
So there's a considerations not to put things in just one big category. You have to really know exactly what's going on with each one of them.
Yeah. The nuance is important. That's something I'm trying to dive into with this podcast as well, because yeah, like you said, there's definitely some applications for GMOs where I think it might be good or it is good, just like something that you're talking about just now with the mycotoxins. But yeah, it's something people should definitely hear about because you do hear a lot of people, including myself. I've never been a big fan of glyphosate. Talk about the side or the negatives of some of these pesticides and whatnot, but then what if it's preventing another way worse toxin to get into your body? And are there human studies on aflatoxin and all that? Like we know
Yeah,
for sure that it's super carcinogenic.
right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's unethical to do those studies, but it's happened sort of in retrospect where we know that people have eaten something and they can be tested afterward.
Is there a way to like flush some of these out of our body?
I mean, that's what the liver is trying to do, is trying to clean it out. Aflatoxin is worse because it gets into the liver cells and it's an epoxide, a glue
Oh
that
man.
glues the DNA together. And so that's the main problem with it, why it's a problem in the liver, because it's this epoxide. So I mean, your liver is pretty good at filtering almost everything out, but not that one because it's you know designed to do that, if you were, as it were.
What are some? Do you know if there's any side effects that show
For
or
for
symptoms? I
what?
guess for aflatoxin, just having too much of it, or is it just all of a sudden you have
Well,
cancer?
if there's too much, you die right away. There's long-term evidence that it causes long over the long term it causes cancer. And otherwise, you can get some like mutations in the. I mean, mutation is causing cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really what's happening in the cells. But
And
you can, an intermediate, there can be nausea and vomiting and things like that.
so maybe definitely maybe stay away from that peanut butter. Are there other like what are the main food groups that are the big offenders here? Do
So
we know?
anything that's made with grains or with peanuts, foods that get stored for a long time. And so those are the things to worry about.
Okay.
And then in some years when it's really dry and the cattle are eating contaminated corn, the aflatoxin get into the milk.
Oh, okay. So
So
that's an
in
important
in
distinction.
98 in for example in 1988 around here there was a drought for almost the whole summer, and the corn, and under those conditions the corn gets contaminated more easily with the aspergillus to make aflatoxin, and the cattle eat that and it gets transformed into another form of aflatoxin in the milk.
In the milk. Yeah, another reason that I don't drink dairy as much anymore. I like some kefir, some fermented dairy is usually what I can handle pretty well. Man, what about like veggies? It's mostly grains, huh? Mostly like
Mostly grains.
legumes, grains, and then this. But he said it's the insects that bring it in. Why does the storing aspect of it play a role?
So once it's there, all the grains are exposed. And if there's one mycelium in there, it can just grow over all the other ones.
Okay, so it just expands basically and
Right.
continues to produce these secondary metabolites that
And
are
any spores that get in can have the potential to germinate.
wow,
In fact, in some grain elevators, most of the dust are actually spores of fungi.
really?
Yeah.
Because I've worked like my stepbrother is an organic farmer in Germany, so I've definitely helped out there. And some, we always wear masks when we do that
Yeah.
because there is a lot of dust like that. But that's cool to know. I didn't know that. I'll have to tell him that he'll find that interesting. So definitely maybe. So what I'm hearing you say is, if you want to be the safe side, definitely grow your own garden.
I think that if you are, I mean, garden garden, if you know where your food comes from, you can definitely control that. Otherwise, eating from diverse sources is your best bet. Not all from the same place is a good idea. Um, so that you get some variety of your foods and not, if any one source is contaminated, your chance of, this contamination being at a level enough high enough to hurt you is smaller.
It's small, yeah. Okay. What about growing on meat? I mean, is that if I'm there's a lot of people doing a carnivore diet now because the idea behind that is really there's some plants don't want to get eaten in a certain way. There's a lot of chemicals that plants produce that might in small amounts have a hermetic effect, I think it's called, on the body. So actually, like a positive effect, but in certain amounts like gluten and lectins and whatnot, some of these anti-nutrients that are found in plants, in certain amounts they can be quite damaging to us. So these people, like, all they do is eat meat. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's
Mhm.
becoming a pretty big thing, and a lot of people are actually benefiting from it because it's like an elimination diet where they're just taking everything out besides the meat, and then they're slowly adding in the foods again to kind of figure out what is
Uh-huh.
causing some of the autoimmune issues. And it usually is grains or the dairy or the plants. And is that like if I'm just eating like a carnivore diet, for example, am I worrying about these aflatoxins at all?
No,
Yeah.
not that I know of,
Okay.
unless you're eating livers. So you should avoid liver anyway.
Yeah, but I don't know. I eat liver because that does have a decent amount of nutrients. And I have, from what I've been researching about it, a lot of people always think that it has like stored toxins, but I guess it's more of a like filtration system where it doesn't actually store the toxin. It just like moves them along the way. But
Right.
I'd have to, yeah, research that a little
It's
more
all
too.
it's all about moderation.
Yeah, and yeah, especially if you're eating liver, it has so much vitamin A. Like there's people that have gotten like a vitamin A toxicity from the liver, but it has all these other crazy, or just now I shouldn't say crazy, but important vitamins and nutrients in it.
Mhm.
It's the reason why a lot of predatory animals always go for the liver first, like wolves and whatnot. Um, so I see some value in it, but yeah, that might be an interesting thing. If these animals are eating these aflatoxins, and then like if it's a grain-fed cow and you're eating the liver, it might have that in the actual cells of that liver, right?
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah, it might be a long shot, but well, I mean, how would you have to worry about that from like, let's say not deer, but cattle that are eating just grass? I guess grass has seeds too, right? Like little grains
I
sometimes, but
doubt it.
yeah,
I
probably
don't
not
think
as
that's
much.
I don't think that's really been studied. I really can't.
Yeah, yeah. I guess this is all not scientific here, but
There's
um,
there's plenty of molds and things like that will grow on cheese, for example.
yeah.
But there's been no known mycotoxin poisoning by fungus growing on cheese.
Okay, that's good to know too, because
So I don't really know.
yeah,
That doesn't mean it isn't there.
yeah. It's definitely something to think about, and I'm happy that you're like bringing this to people's attention because, like I said, I've never heard anyone else talk about it. It's definitely important. Maybe it's just something that they don't want to get like have it get out there, because from what it sounds like, the FDA doesn't really test for it in the way they should. Maybe it's like I think so many other things. Like I know the same goes for olive oil. There's definitely adulterated olive oil that gets into the US market. And there's actually like the fake food market is a $1 billion market. It's kind of crazy. I read there's a whole book called, I think it's called Real Food, Fake Food. and they go over all these different food groups that are usually like where they sell you one ingredient, but it's something totally different. Happens with
I think it's
seafood a
especially a
lot
big
too.
problem in fish.
Yeah, and fish. Yeah, there's actually a whole story of a like a wholesaler that was busted, and they were selling, um, they were calling it, I believe it was red grouper, or red snapper, and it turned out to be catfish from these Asian farms, that were not in like the farms were not in good condition,
Mm.
just not good water that these fish were swimming in, and all that. So yeah, that's another reason to eat local, right? And to kind of go out there foraging, maybe grow your own garden, maybe go hunting, and try to take control of some of that, of your own food supply, I guess.
Unless your local environment is the contaminated one.
Yeah, that's true. That is an issue too, right? With so in some areas and for some peoples. So it's definitely something to think about as well. Awesome. Well, Tom, we talked about a lot today, and we almost did 2 hours, which is great. I love these long conversations. I learned a ton, and I think people listening did as well. I really think this will help people become more informed foragers, and that's what I was hoping to get out of it too. Just build more appreciation for that morel mushroom, because it is an awesome mushroom, and it is one of the, I think they don't call it the big four. There's a name for it, for like the top four mushrooms.
Oh, the foolproof four.
The foolproof four, yeah. And that's morels, I think, chicken of the woods. What else do you know off the
Giant
top of your head?
puffballs and shaggy manes.
Yeah, I think those are the four. That's awesome. I'm sure we could talk about all these other mushrooms as well, but it'll get too long. Maybe we can do another episode sometime in the future if you want.
Yeah,
But
there are a lot of amateur mushroom clubs out there if people want to join them. And that's really the best way to learn about foraging your own mushrooms, and finding spots where you can collect is, there are, I think, 110 or 115 amateur mushroom societies in the United States.
absolutely.
And so that's really a good spot to learn a lot really fast.
That's what I tell people to every time they ask me, how did you learn or whatnot. Obviously, there's a bunch of books out there and just some great resources. Like you have a blog actually that I will definitely touch on here quick, that can help people get started. But really joining like a society like that, or like a club, I think is the best way to just having a mentor and having someone go out there with you and show you the
There's no
differences.
substitute for that at all. I mean, seeing everything in 3D and
Yeah.
seeing where it is in the field is 100 times better than seeing it on a book
Yeah. And that actually
on the internet.
reminds me, I did was gonna, because I did have some more listener questions that we can maybe just touch on real quick. There was one that I've personally asked you before, I know, in the past, but one of my listeners was asking, like, there's a lot of these gourmet mushrooms like lion's mane, maitake, and so on, that a lot of people also claim have a lot of medicinal properties, but how much of that has really been scientifically proven?
There is some evidence that they work, and I think there's something to it, but there are very few placebo-controlled double-blind studies. And
Which
so
are like the gold standard.
that's what I would like to see for a lot of these things. I think there is something to it, and that there is some ways that they work. But I really want to see the double-blind studies, and those are difficult.
Yeah.
They're hard to do technically. So, I mean, I see, but
It's like with anything in nutrition, right? It's
right.
like nutrition is like such a divided field right now, because mostly because it is so difficult to do these gold standard studies, on what people are eating and tracking that, for an extended amount of time. It's just,
Right. And, people's metabolisms differ, and it's really hard to have enough people volunteering for a kind of study or being paid for a kind of study that would give you enough statistical data to show things.
Absolutely, yeah. But like you said, there is probably something to it, and I also think there's value in like ancient traditions, and I mean mushrooms have been used in like ancient medicines for thousands of years. So
Right. But so
maybe
has
there's
rhino horn, and that doesn't do anything at all.
that's a very good point. Yeah, um, definitely another thing to think about. But you know, I either way, these mushrooms taste amazing, and it's
Yeah.
worth going out to gather them. And you're not just you might not be maybe you're not getting any medicinal benefits from the mushrooms, but what they have shown, for example, is have you heard of forest bathing?
No.
I haven't read it yet. There's a whole book I got on it that a friend gave me, but it's basically there have been scientific studies showing that exposure to nature, like a run in nature versus a run on a treadmill, totally affects your body differently. Like a run in nature actually like strengthens your immune system. And I'm not, like I said, I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know too much about it. But it seems to be having some really positive health effects if you're going out in nature and exploring and being physical out there. So there's a lot of fun things or beneficial things that come with foraging.
Right. And the mushrooms are actually very nutritious themselves. They're pretty high in protein and lots of B vitamins. And it's not shocking that there's a lot of minerals considering where they're growing. So, they're good for you, even if there were no medicinal effect, they're good food.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said, they just taste amazing. Cool. So, yeah, I mean, that's all I really wanted to talk to you about today. But I do want you to maybe plug your blog because I know, are you still doing that? Is that,
I've lost access to it, so I have not
oh
updated it
no,
in quite a while. So, but that's at tomvolkfungi.net. There's still good information there,
absolutely.
but I don't have access to it anymore.
Is there any way of getting that back?
Um, I've sort of working on it, but my contact person is retired, so that's the problem.
Hmm. Maybe I'll just have to like copy and paste everything, but that would be not fun.
Yeah, I
That'd
just
be a,
need to move it.
yeah, move it over from somewhere else. Because yeah, I mean, you have all you have so much knowledge. It'd be great to see more content out there. I think that would really help a lot of people. I guess maneuver through this weird and fascinating world of fungi.
Yeah. So join a club, and that's the best way to learn. There's probably one in your state or more than one.
Yeah, look at if you live around universities. I think there's always really going to be a mycology club, most
Yeah.
likely. So that's a great
Yeah,
great
we have
place
one here at
to
UW
start.
La Crosse, and there's in near Seattle, there's 5 or 6 amateur clubs, and that have 50, 500 to 1,000 people in them piece. So
Wow.
so that it's really big in some places.
And another thing, I talk about this a lot on the podcast, but the Facebook groups have been super helpful for me personally. Just being able to post pictures and then have some of these groups have like 10,000 people in them to just
Right.
you know
And
give
but
answers.
The Dunning Kruger effect is really strong on Facebook.
What's the Dunning Kruger effect?
The people who have only a little bit of experience don't know what they don't know yet.
Yeah, I can see that. That's true. It's easy to just leave a comment real fast, right? Even if you haven't studied fungi for 40 years like you and whatnot. Awesome. So where else can people find you? Is it mostly the blog and then you're a professor at the University of Wisconsin La Crosse?
Yeah.
I know there's video like lectures of you online. You even did like a TED talk once, if I recall
Mhm.
correctly. So
Yeah.
there's
That's about
definitely
my heart transplant.
yeah, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But there's other content out there that goes over that for people to check out. So yeah, you've lived a really fascinating life, and I think people should check more out about your story. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can do this again with maybe another mushroom sometime.
Good. Sounds fun.
Awesome. All right. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.